Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe on the SABC News channel. After one of the bloodiest bouts of the warfare that has roiled Libya intermittently since 2011, Libyans are wary. They hope that the UN-brokered talks currently being held in Tunisia will spur both sides to agree to a solution.
An assault on Libya's capital Tripoli left Rami Obaidi with a bullet to the lung and without both of his hands and a leg. From his wheelchair in Benghazi, the 24-year-old has some advice for the delegates holding UN-brokered peace talks.
What is the solution? The solution is for a committee to be set up that involves all groups and to use people whose hearts are in it for the sake of the nation, who do not want anything for themselves or their own interests.
Obaidi shares the same outlook as many Libyans. After years of war, fighters like him, or for the dead, their surviving family members that Reuters spoke with, are sceptical that the negotiations will yield a long-term solution. The effort includes national elections and a new transitional authority. Mohamed Bayou is another fighter.
Have you, the Libyan officials, consulted those wounded? Have you consulted the amputees who are bitter? You held reconciliation talks without consulting not even one of us. Since the war began, you continue fighting, even if just with a one-legged man. I can no longer see, but I know that you support the war. You have now held talks, held on to your own positions. And in the end, you've left those injured to suffer, and those who were martyred are forgotten. You did nothing for us. You have done nothing for the mothers of those lost, and you have done nothing for the mothers of wounded sons.
Libya has been split since 2014. Currently, the west of the country is held by the internationally recognised Government of National Accord, and the east is home to Khalifa Haftar's LNA, or Libyan National Army. A ceasefire was agreed last month, but bouts of chaos and bloodshed go back almost a decade. Hawa al-Rumli is still weary. Her husband was killed in 2011, and she is angry at the lack of support from the state.
We hope there will be an end to the bloodshed. We are tired of it. 10 years later, it's the same endless cycle. We want reconciliation, but with the knowledge that there are people who must be held accountable by the law after the talks, there are those who must be handed justice.
The LNA's assault on Tripoli lasted 14 months before ending in June. It killed and maimed fighters on both sides and civilians caught in it, and worsened living standards, leading to protests this summer.
Sami Hamdi is the editor-in-chief of The Interest, a United Kingdom-based international magazine, and is a regular commentator on Middle East and North Africa politics. He joins us now via Skype from London. Sami, always good to talk to you, and it seems that when we do chat, something has been signed or agreed, but we always wait for something to play out. Are we at another one of those moments, do you think?
I think what you say is true. We've heard of these talks before. We've heard of these reconciliation discussions. There's always discussions with peace talks, and then it descends once more into chaos and even more bloodshed. What I will say is that these talks differ from previous talks in that the military dynamics on the ground are finally balanced in a way in which they haven't been since 2011. You'll remember that the Libyans who protested against Gaddafi could not take out Gaddafi without the support of NATO, and that brings its own receipt that they have to pay. NATO doesn't just come in for free. It's not necessarily a charity. Then, of course, Haftar using the military forces to assert himself. There was always an imbalance of forces, whether it's one side or the other. But today you have a balance as a result of Turkish intervention on one side and Russia, Egypt and UAE on the other. And that means that because there is no possibility of a military solution, all of the parties are now engaged in a political process to see if they can gain something through these talks. Haftar will hope for a senior position in the military. Sarraj will hope for a position in the government, whether it's Bashagha or these other individuals will all hope for a position in the government or a power sharing agreement that will recognize their influence, that will recognize their gains that they have worked hard for, not necessarily for the Libyan people, but for themselves and for their own futures. I do think there is hope that these peace talks will lead to an end to the gunfire and the bullets, but it will not end the political instability. And I think what we're seeing is a transition from the battlefield to the political wrangling, whereby the Libyan parties are increasingly demonstrating a propensity to act as proxies for international power, as opposed to taking the harder option of actually seeking a popular mandate from the Libyans.
In the package that we played just before we started talking, we heard one young fighter who no longer fighting because he was maimed. He says that they're having these talks, but we're not included. It does sound as if there are a lot of voices perhaps that should have some say that are not being heard.
I think, Peter, look, it's a harsh thing to say, and I think it's very cold of me to say it. And I think that in reality, we haven't been allowed to say it in the past 8 years of this conflict because it wasn't necessarily popular to say it. But it's important to understand that but for NATO, Gaddafi would not have been taken out. And that brings its own very unique dynamics in that the Libyans who overthrew him knew that the power was not necessarily with the Libyan people if they wanted to rule, but in the appeasement of NATO. In order to stay in power, they realized they did not need to win over the Libyan people who together did not take out Gaddafi, but rather one faction had to go to Paris, one faction had to go to Washington, one faction had to go to London. They had to go to the international powers, they felt, in order to secure the power to stay in control. And I think even in 2014, when we saw elections once more with a very low turnout, we saw one side decide to lean on Qatar, to lean on other international powers, and we saw the other side lean on the UAE. At no point have this new generation of Libyan politicians felt that that it is of an essence to secure a popular mandate to go towards the Libyans. And that's why I know it's a very unpopular thing to say, but it completely alters the dynamic when you have a regime that's been ousted by NATO. I'm not saying that Gaddafi was a good man. What I'm saying is that the fact that NATO took him out meant that you automatically created a system whereby power lies with the international brokers and not necessarily with the Libyan people. And even today, when you're talking about this individual who's saying that Libyans are not involved, he's perfectly right. The parties that are engaged are those which called in Turkey, those which called in the UAE, those which called in Russia. The only reason they're engaged in the process is because Washington has told them to. Ankara has told them to. Moscow has told them to. Cairo has told them to. The only reason they're engaged with the process is because these international powers have said, we're not ready to support you in another military solution. You have to go and sit down and talk it out. It's not because these parties suddenly believe that the Libyans want peace or that they've been forced to the table because of the Libyan people. And when they're discussing this power sharing agreement, they're discussing it by leaning on the international brokers, not on the Libyan people. In other words, the power sharing agreement that they're discussing is being decided by the international powers. Turkey's allies will get this, Russia's allies will get that, US allies will get that. And that's what we mean when we say the Libyans have no part in this international process. And that's the tragedy of Libya, in that even 8 years on, the Libyan people are still not the source of power. They are still not the group that these powers are going to and saying, let's hear what the Libyans think. And that's why when we saw in the initial ceasefire, we saw protests calling for all of the politicians to be kicked out and for new faces to appear. And that's why I think that whenever we discuss in the Libyan narrative, what is good with regards to these talks is this increasing narrative that's emerging, that is starting to put everything into perspective, that maybe this began as a revolution, but it veered off the track of a revolution when NATO intervened, and now we're paying the price for it. I think the last point I will make on this is this. People need to understand, for those who don't follow Libya, in that when NATO overthrew the Gaddafi regime, the militias that NATO armed went and embarked on revenge attacks. They began to accuse people, irrespective of evidence, accusing people of being part of the Gaddafi regime and killing them ultra-virus outside the judicial process. They blockaded whole towns that they accused of being pro-Gaddafi in order to cement individual fiefdoms. What I believe well and truly is that Libya needs a national reconciliation process before even a power sharing agreement. You need to agree on a narrative in that not every Libyan was against Gaddafi, not every Libyan is in favor of this new political administration, and you need to recognize grievances that exist on both sides, and that this is not a battle for good versus evil, as perhaps one side insists on painting.
So if the Libyans don't have power and don't have this voice, what is the predominant motivation at this stage? Is it fatigue of war and therefore they will allow this process to continue? And then are we just kicking down the road the can where the Libyan people will want and demand their voice at some point?
I think there are two aspects, two dynamics in this. I think the first is there is a suggestion that's been made by the Tunisian president and that's been touted for quite some time, in that those who are participating in these talks will be forbidden from taking up any post in any power sharing agreement. I don't think necessarily this will go through, but I think when this is put in the context of the fact that there is an alternative political process taking place, so you have on the one side, you have US, Germany, you have the Qataris on one side, and on the other side, you have Russia, Turkey, and Egypt with their own political process. I think we see that the power sharing agreement is far more complicated. This political process is far more complicated than a case of the Libyans asserting themselves. The direct answer to your question is this. Everybody is talking about the prospect of elections. If Libyans can mobilize effectively to take advantage of these elections, if they can put some faith in these elections and essentially overthrow these parties through the ballot box and avoid the politics of fear, then that is perhaps a door that can change the dynamics. The issue, of course, is you haven't solved the problem that existed in 2011 and 2014 when elections took place then, which is these militias that coerce and bully voters into supporting one way or not participating in elections the other way. The reality is that it's a polarized society, and as of yet, there's no figure that's emerged that calls on the unity of the Libyans. We're still talking about East and West. We're still talking about tribes. And the reality is that I know I sound like somebody who is crashing the party and giving a very pessimistic view of things, but the reality is that the Libyans need to find some way to mobilize as a civil society, as a third party, not necessarily the GNA and LNA, but as a third party that places individual pressure on these parties to respond. How they do that practically is very difficult when you have militias roaming around with impunity.
How was Gaddafi able to hold this country together then with all these tensions that you're talking about, East, West and tribe?
I think what Gaddafi excelled at was Gaddafi understood the tribal dynamics of the Libyan society. So he would elevate some tribes at the expense of others. And if that tribe got too arrogant, he would smash that tribe by promising another tribe that position of the tribe that they're smashing at that particular time. So he essentially was dancing on the heads of snakes, as the Yemeni president once famously said about governing Yemen, which is also a tribal society. I think what Gaddafi managed to do was adopt a policy of appeasement, deal with Libyan allegiances as they were according to their tribe, as opposed to how perhaps the international community wants it to be, this idea of individualism, one man, one woman, one vote, which currently is not necessarily prevalent in Libya. We see, for example, today that the reason Haftar was so successful, even though I accept that Haftar is a disastrous influence on Libya, the reason Haftar was so successful is that on the internationally recognized government side, you had this assertion of a new political dynamic, this idea of individualism and democracy and voting and the like. Haftar said, listen, I'm going to adopt what the Libyans understand, which is a tribal society. I'm going to speak to the tribal chiefs. I'm going to speak to the power brokers. I'm going to unite them and appease them and offer them something of the other. And that's why Haftar is the only Libyan figure that managed to unite the eastern tribes and the southern tribes and establish a foothold whereby he was able to launch his year-long offensive on Tripoli. I think when it comes to how Gaddafi managed to rule, I don't necessarily call it a wisdom, but I think there is a lesson in that you have to decide whether we treat Libya as it is or whether we treat Libya as how we want it to be. The reality is that you have tribal dynamics. You need to live with that and you need to accept it. Society is very different from what Europe and the US are used to. And I think that particular dynamic has been lacking in the democratic process that is trying to be implemented in Libya.
All right, we're running out of time, and there is one question I'd love to ask you. Sad news of the passing of Palestinian chief negotiator Saeb Erekat, and I just wonder how significant this is, particularly at this time in Palestine's journey.
I think the death of Saeb Erekat is very tragic, and it comes at a very difficult time for the Palestinians. UAE is normalizing ties with Israel, so is Bahrain, so is Sudan. Saudi Arabia under the table is believed to be considering it as well. It's a disastrous time for the Palestinian cause, which has seen its Arab tribal allies, its Arab allies, cousins, abandon the cause. But I do think that what it has instilled, this recent events, and why I think that Saeb Ariqat, despite the fact we will lose a very shrewd negotiator, I do think it will add to this impetus that the Turkish President Erdogan is leading to bring about a reconciliation between the Palestinian factions, to unite them once more. And I think if these Palestinian factions unite, then it will be a momentous occasion that even Saeb Ariqat would be very proud of, and it would essentially help to temper the impact of the betrayal of the Arabs to the Palestinian cause.